Welcome and thank you for joining today's CCS talk session, the European Green Deal and CCS, a fireside chat with DG CLIMA's Artur Runge-Metzger. My name is Galoran Turan and I'm the General Manager of Advocacy at the Global CCS Institute, and I'll be the moderator today. The Institute is an international think tank whose mission is to accelerate the deployment of CCS as a global climate mitigation technology. We're headquartered in Melbourne and have presence in 5 countries, including Brussels, Belgium, Japan, China, UK, and US. Before we start the fireside chat, I would just like to say a few words of housekeeping. You will see at the top of the bar a button that says everyone, and if you click everyone, if you click that button, you'll be able to see Eve and Artur, and when I'm online with my webcam on, as well as the slides when we're using them. Today's webinar will be roughly 45 minutes. We've planned the first 30 minutes for the fireside chat, and at the end of the webinar, for the last 15 minutes or so, there will be an opportunity for Artur to respond to questions. We encourage all the attendees to participate, all the participants to this webinar to ask questions, and you can do that by going into the control panel, the GoToWebinars control panel that you can see on your screen. Finally, the webinar will be recorded, and everyone who's signed up for it will receive a link to it after the webinar is over. I would very much like to welcome Mr. Artur Runge-Metzger to our webinar today. Artur is the Director for Climate Strategy, Governance and Emissions from Non-Trading Sectors in DG CLIMA of the European Commission. Artur has been shaping both European and international climate policy during his long career with the Commission. Today, our focus is on the European Green Deal, and we'll hear about the latest developments and insights on the role of CCS. During the fireside chat, Artur will be interviewed by our Senior Advisor for International Climate Policy, Eve Tamme. Eve has worked on climate policy for almost 15 years in her roles in the Estonian national government, in DG CLIMA, and just before joining the Institute in Estonian permanent representation to the EU. And with that, I turn over to you, Eve.
Thank you, Galoran, and a warm welcome to everyone who has joined this webinar. It's great to see so many of you with us. It shows there's a lot of interest in the topic. Artur, I'm very pleased to have this conversation with you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. You've been instrumental in your different roles in shaping European climate policy, and you've also been deeply involved in the international climate negotiations. And I remember it well from the time when I used to work with you. And you're also extremely well placed to share the views on the role of CCS in the European Green Deal, with several departments in DG CLIMA working on different aspects of CCS. So to start out, I'd like to take a few steps back and ask you just to find out, how has the new Commission changed your work and the way you work? The structure of the Commission has changed. You're working on the huge new project, the European Green Deal. How is it like now it has been going on for more than half a year? How has DG CLIMA evolved in the context of all of this?
Of course, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to the fireside chat on CCS, which I do with great pleasure, because we have been in DG CLIMA and in the Commission working for so long on carbon capture and storage, and these days also on the use and storage. So it's a real pleasure to update you a little bit on the latest thinking inside the Commission. With the von der Leyen Commission, I think what we have seen is, it's a start like a rocket in terms of climate policy, because only 11 days after the new Commission started last year in December, the Green Deal communication was presented. And it is a very ambitious policy agenda for the coming 2 years. In the Green Deal communication alone, there is almost 50 new initiatives that have been put out there to be executed over the next 2 years, many of the regulatory ones going into co-decision process. Since then, you will have seen the Just Transition Fund proposal that has come up in this context, the Sustainable Investment Plan that has been put forward to support the Green Deal, the digital strategy, the industrial strategy, and you see a thread through all of them that binds them together, and that is decarbonizing Europe and getting to climate neutrality by the year 2050. And I think that is the second real event that happened in December when the heads of state in Europe came together and said, yes, we want to embark onto that journey. And the first piece of legislation in that direction was the climate law that is now being discussed between Council and Parliament.
Yeah, that's indeed, it's a huge and a very fast process so far. Now, if we start to unpack the European Green Deal and the role of CCS in it, and this is what everyone who has turned up today wants to hear about, then obviously to get to that climate neutrality, there's a wide range of measures and technologies that need to be implemented in order to achieve it, and CCS is one of them. Now, where and what kind of role do you see for CCS in the pathway to climate neutral Europe?
I think the underlying analysis for the Green Deal is the Commission's long-term strategy. And I think the long-term strategy came out very clearly that in the year 2050, in order to be climate neutral, we will have to have carbon dioxide removals. And quite a significant amount, because there will still be quite a number of sectors that will have emissions. And that means you need to create this balance, the balance that the Paris Agreement is talking about between emissions and removals. And I think very clearly our analysis shows that carbon capture and storage is going to play a role there next to the kind of nature-based solutions in terms of forests and land. In terms of the scale, I think this is something we will have to see in the coming decades, because that will also depend on how competitive the different removal technologies are going to be. We see the prices for CCS are still coming down. So in the end, in terms of the scale of CCS, that will depend, one, on the cost of the technology, but then, of course, everybody knows there's also a societal debate that we need to have on the acceptance of CCS, where there's still quite some concern in a number of member states.
Okay, now you covered at the moment more of CCS as the carbon removal technology, right? But then there's also the other side where CCS is going to be used, and that's the industrial decarbonization. So when we talk about the cement production, steel production, is there anything, and also obviously hydrogen, so is there anything from the emission reduction side that you would like to share, just to start unpacking the whole thing?
I think you're absolutely right, Eve, that there's many ways how CCS can be linked up with the various sectors. And I think if we look back in terms of the, 15 to 20 year history of CCS, I think 20 years ago, everybody was assuming that CCS is in the first place there in order to decarbonize power plants, particularly coal power plants. And I think in the meantime, that view has changed quite a lot, that we really need to look at what we call the hard to abate sectors, where kind of it's very difficult to reduce emissions in a cost efficient manner. And there CCS is going to play an eminent role. And I think you have mentioned some of the industries, whether it is the cement industry, the steel industry, large CO2 emitters, but there's also, of course, the link to some of the energy technologies, for instance, when it comes to the production of hydrogen, where CCS can play a role. So I think it's a very different view we have today, and that I think also influences kind of the way in terms of the rollout of CCS is going to happen. And I think here an indication is kind of the projects of common interest that were also adopted in December, which show it's really about the interlinkages between the different sectors. How can you bring it together? The dream that we had 20 years ago, there's a single site and that is going to capture sufficient CO2, and then you have CCS attached to it. I think that model is gone. We're talking about clusters, we talk about transport, and there's different ways of doing that.
Indeed. Now, before moving on to maybe talking a bit more on clusters and transport and the infrastructure, when we talk about the targets and the pathway, you already mentioned the Clean Planet for All, the vision for the long-term strategy. That was developed with the current 2030 targets in mind. But now with the upcoming climate target plan, the Commission is looking at how to increase the target to 50 or 55%. So now in this context of the upcoming climate target plan, and then following revisions of the legislation to really implement these new targets, would you see that EU would need to deploy more CCS technologies and sooner, because essentially that would also change the trajectory, because suddenly the 2030 is in a different place than it would be based on the current target. So is there anything you could share on that front?
I think that's again, it's not too difficult, because the underlying analysis, kind of, if you want, in a rough way, was done in the long-term strategy. And we are now looking at raising the target from the -40% to -50 or perhaps -55%. Of course, you can find these points on the trajectory towards 2050. And we would have come across them sometime around 2035 or 2036 or 2037. So it means really we are going to need to speed up. So what would have happened in the second part of the 30s, that is going to happen or should happen in the early 30s. And that means that a number of technologies will have to be deployed faster. And CCS, which is not one of the cheapest technologies, it also means that probably it will have to happen earlier. So it's really important for Europe in the coming years to demonstrate the technology and look at the different angles. As I said before, it can be applied in many different ways, and what we need is real at-scale examples on how to deploy the technology, to learn faster and to reduce the cost of CCS faster than what would have happened otherwise.
Oh, that's very interesting. And now going back to the carbon removal part of things, which you actually brought up in the beginning, and this is a topic that keeps attracting more and more attention. People are really discovering that now emission reductions are not going to be enough. You really need to increase carbon removal at the same time. And in the Circular Economy Action Plan that came out in March this year, there is a planned regulatory framework for the certification for carbon removals that is planned for 2023. And this has sparked a lot of interest among a wide range of stakeholders. And I would like to ask you, what are the plans with this? I mean, obviously, something that's going to be a very broad exercise, and which parts of the Commission are going to be involved in this work, and what are the next steps in the process to look out for?
I think when you look at the climate policy framework that we have in the European Union. At the moment, we are practically looking at all the emissions from the different sectors, whether we have them under the emissions trading system, or whether we have them under the effort sharing, or whether we have them in the context of land use. But what we do not have is a regulatory framework really looking at all aspects of carbon dioxide removals. So that is something that will become more and more important. If you look at the LTS, as I said, in 2050, remaining emissions will have to be balanced with removals. So it is time to think of a regulatory framework that also then puts out incentives for those parts of the economy that can, if you want, produce those carbon removals. And I think there's two different ways, which I already mentioned in the beginning. One is the more technological way, so that is going the route via CCS. The other one is the nature-based one, so going the route via agriculture and via forestry. And then this already tells you more or less which departments within the Commission will be involved. Because on one side, it's the industries, it's the energy industry, it is the chemical industries, all of them who have an interest to develop carbon capture and storage, and then also maybe have applications to use carbon dioxide, because that might also come into the picture. And then on the other side, you will have agriculture and forestry. So all the colleagues in those departments will have a keen interest in helping to develop this framework. And I think some of the questions are already coming up today. We are talking in the context of the Common Agriculture Policy, for instance, about carbon farming. And we talk in the context of the Innovation Fund, how can we promote innovation in the context of CCUS? So to really develop these areas, these technologies. And I think what we find in our studies we have been doing, let's take for instance on the CCUS side, that there's many different ways and pathways that you can produce carbon removals. So the future framework that needs to be established needs to be flexible enough and open enough in order to accommodate where we are making real progress. And we need to, of course, make sure that this framework is going to be a robust one. And that always has to do with monitoring, reporting, and verification. Across the board, a ton of carbon needs to be a ton of carbon, whether it is counted under the emissions trading system, whether it's counted outside, or whether it is counted as a carbon removal. And one other aspect that is very clear is, yes, there needs to be the possibility to say that this is going to be safely stored for a long period of time. And then if you look across the board on the different technologies, the picture is quite different from each other. Let's look at the nature-based solutions, what happens if you have stored a lot of carbon in a forest and that forest goes up in flames. How do you deal with that in the regulatory framework? So these are questions in terms of permanence, in terms of questions of liability that we will have to look at. So I think it's a very exciting field. Many of the questions that will be posed, we have come across in the past. When it comes, for instance, the experience on CDM projects, when it comes to experiences we are currently collecting with the PCI project. So they will all be of relevance when shaping the framework. So from the side of the Commission, we are interested to gather as much as possible the experiences that have been made. There's also many voluntary activities that are ongoing that do good work when it comes to monitoring, reporting. So these are things we want to take into consideration when crafting that regulatory framework.
Indeed, I mean, permanence is of key importance, and obviously, if you're looking at incentivizing something, you can only manage or incentivize something that you can measure. So it's important to have good accounting in place. And you mentioned really well that currently the policies we have are very sectoral. So we have the ETS sector, we have the non-ETS sector, we have the LULUCF. And often what I hear stakeholders asking is, how should we change ETS to incentivize carbon removals? And at the same time, ETS and ESR, they have been developed to incentivize emission reductions and not to incentivize carbon removals. I know that this is very early days, but at the same time, you know, many of these discussions are not new, as you mentioned. Do you think this framework could be something that is, you know, horizontally on top of all these sectoral policies and then possibly compatible with them? Or would you see that it could be something that leads to changes in these sectoral policies that could then be redefined to incentivize carbon removals in addition to emission reductions?
I think that question in terms of the exact policy design, I think that is something where we will also have to look at various options. I don't think that we should go into the discussion with a closed mind that you can only do it this way or the other way. In the end, these are kind of things that need to be connected with each other. Otherwise, how are you going to achieve a balance between the remaining emissions and the removals? Because that's, as I said in the beginning, what the Paris Agreement is talking about. So these need to be like communicating vases where kind of you will have some, in one way or the other, connections between them. Whether you do that within the same pieces of legislation or separate ones that you link up with each other, I think there's many ways on how you can cut this cake. And therefore, I think it's good to have a good reflection on, what is the best way of dealing with this.
But now coming back to infrastructure side, or you mentioned transport. Maybe actually first on the transportation side, because we were just talking about the existing policies we have in place. And one of the challenges currently for CCS project developers is the fact that the non-pipeline CO2 transport is not covered by the ETS. So if they choose to transport the CO2 by ships or trucks, for example, at the moment they cannot benefit from the carbon price of the ETS. But we also know that there are several upcoming projects that intend to make use of those other types of transports. And the stakeholders at large, they widely expect that this is going to be addressed at some point and like before they start operating. And here's my question. What are the plans going forward now with this? Where is the solution going to be? What should we look out for?
We have received requests in order to provide legal clarity in terms of that particular issue. And in the Commission, we are at present working on coming up with a response. So it's really looking at the possibilities within the legislative framework. And as I said, it's an ongoing discussion. But we would hope to come out very soon with a response to these questions.
Oh, that sounds great. And now as we were kind of slowly moving towards the transport and infrastructure parts, then as you mentioned, this new wave of CCS projects is going to be built as, you know, hubs and clusters. So industrial clusters nearby, for example, ports, or similar, and these installations that can then, you know, they intend to make use of the common infrastructure to transport and store their CO2, and this is obviously what will make it cheaper than the previous idea of everyone building their own capture, transportation, and storage. But at the same time, obviously, you know, it becomes a bit of this chicken and an egg question where, you know, maybe the capture part is not built because the infrastructure is not there, and the infrastructure is not there because no one is yet capturing, and the infrastructure is really seen, at least by the stakeholders, as one of the key enablers for the industries to start really capturing the CO2. And you mentioned the PCIs that were approved in the end of last year that helped with funding this, but what do you see, like what would be the steps that would be most helpful to facilitate the development of the CO2 infrastructure in Europe?
I think one thing definitely is that we see interest in the different participating industries. Because I think, Eva, you are rightly saying that this looks like a chicken and egg problem. But what we find very interesting is that it's either the eggs or the chickens are coming together and are trying to sort this issue out. And that is also something, and that is the reason you will find these projects supported under the PCI. That is something that we need to try out at scale in order to see what lessons can be learned from that. Also, how do you manage an infrastructure like that? Who is going to be the owner of that? Who is going to run it? How do you share the costs? How do you do the financing? So these will be very important examples for the coming years, how to set up this kind of infrastructure. And I believe that many industrial clusters in Europe and probably also abroad will use this and learn from this exercise.
Okay. Indeed, there's a lot of questions out there, but it's also one of the, you know, key steps to move forward, right? I'd like to go back to something you mentioned in the very early parts, and that's the hydrogen. Mm-hmm. If obviously, you know, building out the hydrogen economy is one of the goals and tasks that's going to need to happen under the European Green Deal. Now, how do you see the scale up of green and blue hydrogen happening in Europe from your perspective?
I think both are technological ways in terms of producing hydrogen. And what we see is that the different sectors that are involved in that are showing an interest in order to move forward. From our end, I think we have an interest in keeping as many technologies in the play and those being developed. So whether it is on the electricity side, the green hydrogen, getting to bigger and bigger electrolyzers in order to run down the costs. But there's also an interest, as you can see with the Northern Light project, to see how can you link up the gas that we have with hydrogen and then move to decarbonisation. In the end, which of the technologies is going to win, or whether there will be a winner, maybe the two will be coexist, will depend very much on the technology, on the price of the technology and the price of the hydrogen that you can offer. What we also have, like with the CO2 infrastructure when it comes to CCS, we also, in terms of hydrogen, have a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. We know in which industries hydrogen could be used in the future, but that will also require major investments into technologies. And those and here we talk in some cases about billions of euros that will have to be invested. And at the same time, the hydrogen is not readily available on the doorstep of the factory. So I think this demand and supply side issues, this is something that we will also have to think about and start sorting out in the coming decades, and then gradually build up the hydrogen infrastructure. But I think it will have to be driven very much by the demand of hydrogen. Today, of course, there is a significant amount of hydrogen already used in industry, but that, as you know, is not blue or green hydrogen, but has other colors. So that might be a starting point when it comes to creating the demand for blue and green hydrogen.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm aware that we're getting close to wrapping up this part of the discussion. So before I turn to Lauren for the Q&A session, I'll explore one more topic with you, and I think that's something that is extremely topical today. So let's talk a bit about the green recovery and the role of just transition in it, and the role of CCS in it. Last week, we published a report on the value of CCS, and there was also a webinar to go with it. And in that report, we looked at how these technologies can be a driver for economic growth and also employment. And there have been developments, for example, in the UK, their Committee on Climate Change wrote a letter to the UK and Scottish Prime Ministers where they highlighted the need to retrain and redeploy highly skilled workforce for the low carbon industries like CCS. Another issue they suggested was to strengthen the energy system because there's a need for new hydrogen and CCS infrastructure to support the next phase of the net zero transition. So while being mindful of the roles of the Commission and Member States on financing the economic recovery, do you see similar conversations taking place in other parts of Europe? Like, how does CCS fit in the green recovery process from your perspective?
Mm-hmm. Of course, there is a lot of talk about the recovery from the current pandemic. I think what is going to be extremely important for the recovery is that it is going to be very impactful because we see the economy, the economic recession going deeper and deeper at the moment. And the question is, how fast can we get out of that? So when we talk about recovery on the Commission side, we are looking at the coming 12 to 24 months. And everything that is going to be done, whether it is the 500 billion euros that President Macron and Ms. Merkel were talking about yesterday, or whether it is other money, is this money will have to be spent so that it has an immediate effect on economic growth and an immediate effect on jobs. So that's the most important thing, and it will have to look at the sectors that are being affected most. And I think what Mrs. von der Leyen very clearly said is we should use the recovery in order not to bounce the economy backwards, but to bounce it forwards into the direction of the Green Deal. And that also includes, of course, the digitalization of Europe in the coming years. When you look from that backdrop and then look at CCS, I think within the next 12 to 24 months, it's probably a rather limited role that CCS can play, but we shouldn't stop the CCS project. So when we, for instance, look at the PCI list, these projects should really go ahead without any kind of delay. And I think, therefore, I'm quite happy to see that the investment decision has been made for the Northern Lights project, so that we stay on course and on track. Because I think what we were exploring before is our intention is to do things even faster than what we thought about 2 or 3 years ago. And in that context, we need to make sure that these technologies, these demonstrations are going to be deployed not only within the time frame, but within an accelerated time frame. So that means also during the recovery phase. I think that's important.
Thank you, Artur. I think it's now time to go back to Lauren and see how the questions are coming on.
Artur, thank you so much. And indeed, questions have been pouring since we started. And I've got sort of 3 pages that I've jotted down here that I could follow from the control panel, and also a lot of comments. The first comment actually came 5 minutes after 2 my time, and I would just like to respond to it because it said, since Petronova plant facility that came online in 2018, it seems there's been no large-scale facilities, and is this all about studies and no real action? I would like to actually respond to that and say that's not entirely correct, because Gorgon came online in Australia as a gas processing facility with CCS. The CCS part came online last year. There are 4 facilities under construction, 2 in Canada and 2 in China. And I would like the Gen to urge everyone, but particularly the gentleman who made the comment, to read our global status report, which is available on our website. So it gives me also a chance to do a little bit of PR for our reports as well. But I'm quickly going to now sort of go to the questions. EU roadmap. Is there an EU roadmap for deployment of CCS? And in particular, are there targets in terms of million tons of abatement that EU foresees from CCS over the kind of coming decades?
Kind of at the level of the European Union, there is no such plan in terms of saying that certain targets need to be accomplished when it comes to how much needs to be captured. What we will look at in the context of the 2030 climate target plan, where the impact assessment is going on right now, is of course kind of what type of role could we expect CCS to play in the context of 2030. So that is something we will look at again. But whether that will lead to certain quota, I think that is something we will have to look at after September when it comes to the shape of the policy architecture, whether that would be really required in the context of 2030. As I said before, most important for us is assisting in demonstration projects, and this has to happen within the next year. So therefore, the Innovation Fund, Horizon Europe, these are important initiatives where we will have to look at CCUS. And that's much more imminent than looking at the regulatory framework, because every piece of legislation that we are going to propose in June 2021 will still take a year or maybe even 2 or even longer before it's decided by the Parliament and by the Council and before it really becomes effective and is going to be implemented. And in terms of the next steps on CCS, we can't wait until then.
Thank you very much, Artur. You started to allude to that in the chat itself and just now, but there have been a number of questions on financing CCS. How are CCS projects meant to be in Europe and meant to be in EU, meant to be financed? There's some questions around, I think, Innovation Fund, and particularly how it links with EU or its relationship with EU ETS, the role of PCI. So is that going to be a source of financing? So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how we see financing come through.
Kind of there's different functions of the different ways we can support technology development. You have mentioned the PCIs. These projects of common interest will allow specific support to be given to those projects so that they don't fall prey of particular state aid rules and so on. And it shows prioritization in terms of what needs to be done next. When it comes to the direct funding, then we have the Innovation Fund, and we will issue the first call of the Innovation Fund by July this year. So kind of we are really setting it up at the moment. Some might have heard that in the last days the decision has been taken that what is currently called INEA, the Innovation Executive Agency, is going to help us in implementing the projects, and the colleagues in our house and also in INEA are very busy at the moment to draft the first call, to kind of get the financing decision so that we know how much money is going to be available for the first call and then try to speed up things as much as possible. We want to be on time with this call, also because of the corona pandemic, because we know that many companies are suffering at the moment and losing a lot of cash, and that reduces their capability of investing in research and technology development. And then I think we should be ready with the funding that we have available from the public side in order to move things forward as was planned, in order to see as little delays as possible. When it comes to the ETS, of course, the CCS is recognized under the ETS. But the issue was over the last years that if you look at the carbon price that we have 2-3 years ago, €5 per ton of carbon dioxide, and even today where it is around 18, 19, 20 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, that is not getting a CCS project really off the ground, because the cost of the technology per ton of carbon dioxide is going to be higher. So there will have to be additional policies in place in order to get us over that. And therefore, I think from our end, the need to have funding like the Innovation Fund available to support these projects directly.
Thank you very much.
Kind of the fourth, if you want, if we are going to increase the ambition by 2030, that should have, I think, an impact on the carbon prices, definitely.
Okay. You mentioned Corona, and as you can imagine, a number of questions have come around related to the ongoing pandemic and the current economic circumstances. How do you anticipate the current situation impacting climate policies in the context of EU? And more specifically, there are questions about the recovery package, and there's a specific question related to CCS saying, could there be a role for the Commission to support cross-border transport of CO2 and hydrogen, particularly within the recovery context? So a few questions around the current circumstances and the Commission's potential thinking.
I think, as I said before, we understand the difficulties many companies are facing at the moment, where liquidity is going down, where it's going to become more difficult to keep innovative projects on track. And that is, I think, where the thinking also starts on the side of the Commission to say that we need to make sure that we kind of accelerate in certain areas that are particularly important for the Green Deal, the rollout of these things in the coming years, to make sure that it is really going to happen. In terms of the details, as you see in the news every day, this is a big discussion in Europe among member states on how to take it forward. The Commission is going to present its proposals during the course of next week. But even then, it will require further discussions among member states and Parliament. But hopefully these things can be quickly concluded, because the most important thing is to really get started on the recovery as soon as possible. I think that is going to be important. In terms of the projects that are being thought about, I think you have mentioned two areas. Hydrogen, this is something that has been prominently mentioned in the industrial strategy. It has been mentioned in the Green Deal. So we want to move forward on that agenda. So that is certainly an area where we will cast a particular eye on to see what type of support can be provided.
Thanks very much. And I'm cognizant that we should be starting to wrap up. So I'll just ask one final question. And again, I'll try to bring a few questions into one. And this is about carbon dioxide removal. In particular, there's a question around the Commission's view of permanence in terms of geological or biospheric storage, nature-based solutions versus carbon dioxide storage underground. And also the time frame for carbon dioxide removal. There's a question that are you anticipating, is the Commission anticipating CDR only until 2050 or for decades to come and potentially till the end of the century through technologies like BECCS?
I'll start with the last one first because that's the easiest. I think when looking at the latest IPCC reports, particularly the special report on 1.5 degrees, any of the scenarios that you see there shows you how important carbon dioxide removal is going to be, not only in the year 2050, but it's getting even more important afterwards. So we will have to maintain a stream of carbon removals for centuries, practically. And that shows how crucially important this framework is going to be, looking at the certification of carbon dioxide removals. And I think, as I said before, I think we are very aware of the differences between what different technologies can deliver, for instance, in terms of permanence. So this is something that the framework will have to recognize in one way or the other, because with that comes certain risks. Kind of what we have seen, if you look at nature-based solutions over the last 3 years when it was very dry in Europe, that you saw a lot of forests starting to die because of calamities that were entering the forest that were not there before. Because of drought, trees are dying. So I think there is a big investment required on the side of forestry, for instance, in order to make sure that we have the right trees for the climate that we are going to have in the second half of the century. So there's many questions we will have to look at, and that will have to flow from the legislative framework. In terms of the timetable, you will have seen in the Circular Economy Action Plan, what we are thinking of is tabling a proposal by the year 2023, and then to enter into a co-decision process with Council and Parliament on that. So there is ample room and space for working together between now and 2023 until we come out, hopefully, with a very robust proposal on this. And we are looking forward to all parts also of the CCS industry to work with during the elaboration of that legislative proposal.
Thank you very much, Artur. It's been a privilege to hosting you today, and a very interesting conversation with Eva. We're grateful. Thank you so much. We will be continuing our CCS Talk series, and we've touched upon some of the issues, questions around technology. So for those of you that are interested in the cost of CCS and their different applications, our next CCS Talks is on June 4th, and it's going to be on the CCS technology cost curve. So we invite you to register for that webinar on our website. In fact, you can register to our upcoming events, watch our previous events on our website as well, and you can see the link to that on the slide there. You can follow us on social media, please do so. And if you have further questions, suggestions in terms of our webinars, or questions about our membership and consultancy services, please don't hesitate to get in touch through those email addresses. And we very much look forward to seeing you again virtually in our next webinar or webinars. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Artur. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much.